Good morning. Good morning. Morning. I mean, really great stuff, but not stuff that we don't know. You know, this year will all just reinforce much of what we already know. So the real question, therefore, becomes how do we really shift the paradigm in terms of the mindset of politicians? And that is, if we can't answer that, then we will be here 15 years from having the same conversation. I just want to quickly, though, the issue of diversification, which again is really my pet peeve. I want to say, and this relates to Dr. Farrell, I know IDB has done a lot of work on diversification, but in my view, the work that you have done really is by and large desk review type of work. In my view, diversification really is a get your hands and feet dirty type of work. And I believe very strongly we need an institution that is not just in an advisory capacity, but one singular institution that has overall responsibility for non-energy diversification, that is working directly with industry in terms of really defining comparative and competitive advantage and really trying to move forward. I have a lot more I could say on that, but I'd like your thoughts on that. And secondly, I want to agree with Nira that really we want to focus on the new jobs, the new economy, which are high paying. But the basis of many of those really are basic stuff. So if we take agriculture, Finland, for example, went into high-end value adding based on the agricultural sector. And the issue of land is still important because if you take, I'll just use 3 examples, cocoa, honey, peppers, in which we have comparative and competitive advantage. But we can't be talking about destination cocoa and adding value in cocoa if our production of the basis of which we're talking about, the basis of the sector, which is our high-end cocoa beans, we have taken production from 30,000 in the 60s to now 500 tons. How do you fix that problem? Let's take honey. We have comparative advantage in production of honey. We're 1 or 2 countries in the world where our bee stock is not infested by disease. That's comparative and competitive advantage. We have a basis on which to do significant value adding. But unless we allow for the environment, and you're right, Nirad, in terms of a lot of it doesn't need money. It needs government to do things that needs to support it. Let's take peppers, for example. We have a value-adding sector in pepper sauce and all sorts of things. However, most of what we use in order to support it is imported. Even us, Trinidad and Tobago, boast of having the hottest pepper in the world, even in the global market for fiery foods are increasing. But our production of hot peppers are not matching, and our ranking is not matching. So the mismatch between all the institutional environment. The issue on farmers say, land tenure. It's not going to cost government money. If I don't have land tenure, then I cannot treat with the source of what you need in order to be able to move up the value chain and really offer the kinds of jobs. So just your thoughts on those things, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, could you, if you have a question, could you just move to the mic, please, so that we can have those. Thank you, Indira, for the question and comments.
All right, good morning. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the presentations. Mr. Schwartz, I know you mentioned that the whole issue of the debt to GDP ratio is what I'm more interested in, actually. In that there was an indication that beyond, I think, 30% in the region, there's some decline in growth at that level. But for all intents and purposes, most of the agencies have been indicating that there is no established threshold level for debt to GDP ratios. They indicate that, yes, it's a dangerous level, but they have not come out and said this is the threshold. So what are your thoughts on that, in having some consensus and establishing an agreed upon threshold that we can work with, or simply just continuing to talk about beyond this level, it's going to decline? And then I had another question for Dr. Farrell. I know we talk about the current account balance, we talk about the challenges with the foreign exchange and whatnot, but I think that's something that we are a little bit might be missing a little bit, is that I've been looking at where our, in terms of the elasticity continuum on our demand for foreign goods. I would think that it's borderline inelastic in our demand for foreign goods. So how do we sort of make changes in that regard? Because I do believe if there are any changes that has to be made, it will have to be made such that the consumers would begin to change their behavior and their consumption patterns, which, well, of course, our consumption patterns. So how do we propose that we address something like that fundamentally?
We'll take one more question at the mic before we open it up, and then, time permitting, we'll open up for another round.
Pleasant good morning to one and all. Dr. Farrell, I just want to find out from you if you can give us some insights as it relates to our exchange rate. Exactly what do you think the appropriate exchange rate will be? And it could also give us some insight as it relates to the speed of adjustment. And we started to speak generally that adjustment should be short, but specifically to move the exchange rate in terms of the speed of adjustment, how fast should we move to do that? The second thing is a comment really. In the budget, and I agree with the finance minister, he needed to make some adjustment to several tax rates, and I agree with that. But one of the things that I remain concerned with is the efficiency of the taxation system. And we are not really, there remain significant leakages within the system. And we need to begin to plug those things. And I'm not sure if resources are really being, or sufficient resources are being channeled towards effectively dealing with that particular problem. And my final comment is to Dr. Farrell. How do we convince the government to produce and to publish a medium-term fiscal strategy, which I think is absolutely critical? It will help us to return to a balanced budget, amongst other things.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Let me open it up.
Great. Thank you very much for the question. First of all, for Indira on the diversification thing, you should probably read Winford James in the Express today. And a very interesting article by Winford James where he talks about, he analyzes the budget, he does a kind of exegesis of the budget statement and the words used and so on. And he concludes that the words used evince no commitment to diversification. I agree with you entirely. Diversification is about hands-on and it's about implementation. What the advisory board had done is that we, consistent with our mandate and our terms of reference, we prepared a diversification roadmap and strategy which we handed over to the government some time ago. Among the things that we said inside of there was to how do you address the question of implementation. And we dealt with that issue very frontally. There are a couple of things that we need to understand. One is that for diversification to happen, it is not about hitting sixes and fours. It's about making singles and twos all around the wicket. It's not about looking for the next big thing, not the next big point thesis. It is corralling and working with a large number of people in the private sector across many industries. We are agnostic as an advisory board about what particular industries should promote diversification. However, we did identify that there are sort of 7 broad areas or clusters or industries, if you want to call them that, which we should give particular emphasis to for the reason that the private sector has told us that those are the things that they think could generate export earnings going forward. And we have defined that diversification in terms of increasing foreign exchange earnings. What did we say about implementation? Quite simply, we said, look, the public service is not equipped to do that. And therefore, our recommendation was that there should be an implementation oversight committee composed of people drawn from the implementing agencies like Export TT, Invest TT, and so on. Because one of the things that you need to do in terms of implementing diversification is to work very closely with the people in the private sector. You need to engage them. They need to trust you. They need to share their plans with you. They need to share their issues and their problems with you. And by the way, it is not necessarily and only about money, about funding. It's about many other things that the private sector needs to enable them to be able to get out there. In our view, the critical thing for the government to do in terms of the public sector has to provide the enablers, not to identify the industries. You could talk about yachting. If you start talking about yachting, talk about maritime, then what does the public service do? What does the government do? They can't do anything. It is the private sector that has to do. But we, as the public sector, has to create the enablers, and we have identified what some of those enablers are. It's about innovation, and how do we support innovation in those sectors. It's about the diaspora, and how do we engage the diaspora. It's about market access and how do we promote economic and commercial diplomacy and get our foreign service to have commercial attaches in the markets in which we want to penetrate. Those are the things, quite frankly, if I were talking about a budget and talking about diversification, those are the things that I would be talking about in the budget, not about yachting and maritime and so on and so forth, because tomorrow morning it could be some other industry, it could be some other sector. It could be something that we have not foreseen. But if you have the enablers and you create the enabling environment for the private sector working in tandem with the public sector, then you are going to begin to see some of those results. On Darren's point about the elastic demand for imports and so on, and the economists here would know about the Marshall-Lerner condition and all that kind of things and so on. My argument on the question of the exchange rate movement does not depend on any Marshall-Lerner condition or any such thing. It goes back to Alexander's article in 1951 or 52, and it really is about the income effect. Prices have to go up. I am not interested, quite frankly, speaking personally, about telling people like what brand of cornflakes they should eat or what brand of ice cream they should buy. If they want to buy Häagen-Dazs, let them buy Häagen-Dazs. Because we happen to have a society that is organized that way. We are not a socialist society, and we're not a communist society where we tell people what clothes to wear, what to eat. But if you want to buy Häagen-Dazs ice cream, if you want to drive a Mercedes-Benz, then you pay for it, quite simply. And then what you do is that because the exchange rate is a blunt instrument, what you then do is that because the price of basic food is going to go up, the price of rice and the price of potatoes and flour and so on is going to go up, then the government can target and subsidize those particular things that where the poor, the vulnerable society may be affected as a result of any exchange rate adjustment. So it is really the income effect that I'm looking for in terms of achieving the adjustment in the current account to get our balance of payments back in order, not about the demand for imports is an elastic demand. Now, by the way, I've seen people throwing around all kinds of numbers about the import coefficient and so on. As far as I know, and the economists here can correct me, is that the import coefficient in this country is about 40%. It's nowhere near 80 and 90% that people have been talking about. On the exchange rate and the speed of adjustment, just let me say one thing. I mean, I'm not going to call a number, right? Because it would be imprudent, it would be quite foolish, quite frankly, for me to call a number. I don't know what the right number is. What I would say is that when we instituted the system that we now have in 1993, we instituted a system of managed floating. Free floating of the exchange rate in this economy makes absolutely no sense. The exchange rate cannot be allowed to float freely. If it floats freely, it will sink. Let's understand that. It has to be managed. And we happen to have an institutional structure here where the central bank gets a lot of the foreign exchange that allows the central bank to manage the foreign exchange. And that's what we instituted. But the central bank has to manage the exchange rate and eye to a number of things, including the possibilities for diversification and growing exports. And therefore, what it ought to have been doing, and which it did successfully between 1993 and about 2002, is that it adjusted the exchange rate very gradually. And people did not even notice. It started at 576. And there were no complaints when the rate reached 639 or 640. Nobody complained. It wasn't an issue. There were occasionally a little bit of a queue and so on because of how the system worked, but there was no outcry. There was no talk of devaluation. But unfortunately, in my own view, the central bank failed for a long period of time to adopt a rule in respect of how it ought to have moved the exchange rate. So that by the time the crisis came along in 2014, 2015, in my view, the exchange rate should already have been over $7. If you had followed a simple rule which simply says that I am going to move my exchange every year by the difference between the inflation rate of my trading partners, the United States, and my core inflation rate in Trinidad. If you had done that, the rate would have just simply depreciated very quietly for 1%, 1.5% a year, and there would have been no outcry. People would have been making that adjustment over 15 years. Now we are at a point, unfortunately, where we are significantly overvalued, and therefore the possibility of a sharp, sudden adjustment, which some people call devaluation, not quite correct, but is now required in order to achieve the current account stabilization that is required. And my final, what's the final comment about tax system linkages, or how to convince the government? I don't know how to convince the government to do anything.
Okay.
He whispered that he's still trying.
Sure. We're out of time actually, yeah? So I'm going to have to ask you guys to make some, we have questions here, but as quickly as we can address them before I close off the panel, please.
Final comments, then?
Final comments, yes, you can, or if you want to quickly address any questions.
So I'll tie my final comment to a sort of response to Indira, in the sense that how much cocoa does Switzerland produce? 0. And therefore, if we have to think differently. My point about land wasn't, of course we could have agriculture where we are focused on the primary production and trying to integrate it into the higher value and value added parts of the value chain. But we have to think differently. We are still having the conversations today that we had in the 1960s and 70s. And so Matooks produces pepper sauce, but they import most of their pepper mash. Is that a bad thing? No, it is not. It is not if they are getting that product outside and earning foreign exchange and creating jobs and bringing their foreign exchange back for reinvestment and doing other things too. Would it be nice if we could expand pepper production for them to get more pepper mash from Trinidad and Tobago? Yes. Is it essential? No. Wouldn't you prefer to see those people doing jobs where they have greater and quicker opportunities for upward mobility and less vulnerability for them and their families? I think the answer to that is yes. But we have to think differently. And my challenge to you guys, as the economists, as the young economists, as the thought leaders in society, is to push those kinds of conversations. And I accept the challenge to us that the private sector now needs to step up and start pushing and doing things differently, pushing the government conversations differently and doing things differently with regards to how we organize ourselves in the current context in which we face. And we at Armchair are committed to trying to push that. Just yesterday we had a board meeting about how we're going to approach our discussions at the NTAC, the National Tripartite Advisory Council, on which we have a seat. But we have to push a different conversation about the new economy, which is tied to greater welfare for the people in this country. And by the people, I'm hoping we mean citizens plus, because we also need to grow the population in the country, to develop the home market as a means of increasing welfare and our export capacity, but as a longer conversation.
Thank you. Schwartz.
Just very briefly, I guess there was one question on the debt to GDP and its relationship to growth and the figure I presented at the beginning of the talk. This is just based on empirical evidence, so it's not a specific formula. Once you surpass the 60% level, you are doomed, and if you are at 59, so you are okay. So it doesn't work like that. It's just based on empirical observations. We have seen, and the authors that produced this figure, well, they computed for many, many countries along many, many years, and this is what they have seen. So it's just an indication. And basically the idea is that once you have a significant level of debt in relation to GDP, it becomes a drag to the economy. So you need, and this is kind of related to the fiscal buffers I presented, you need a significant amount of effort in terms of points of GDP just to maintain the debt as it is. So instead of using fiscal policy in terms of counter-cyclical policies, or you have so many necessities in a country like Trinidad that you would like to use your fiscal space in a more sounder and efficient way, you have to service the debt. We have seen examples, and we were talking yesterday about countries that didn't grow for decades just because they had this huge amount of debt. And this is a little bit the rationale of those countries that we have seen that have huge amount of debt and at the end of the day end up restructuring with the creditors. Because even if the country does the right thing and has fiscal measures and budget balance and so on and so forth, the amount of debt is so huge that whatever they do has to be basically used for interest payments. So this is a situation we would like to avoid as much as possible.
Okay, thank you to our panelists. I'm out of time here. I hope these discussions happen well beyond the panel that we have right now and throughout the conference. Let me bring this panel to a close. I'm going to thank you guys and thank the panelists for such a receptive talk here. Thank you, guys.